I used to believe my story had ended long ago, that everything I had once been, a soldier, a lover, a prisoner of war, was buried beneath the ruins of Europe and the passing of years. For decades, I carried that silence with me, even after I left Poland behind and began a quieter life here in America. To everyone else, I was just an old carpenter from Chicago's Polish neighborhood. A man who drank tea every morning, who fixed broken chairs for neighbors, who kept one fading photograph of a young woman tucked inside a drawer. No one asked who she was, and I never told them. Then, one Sunday, an ordinary day, with the kind of stillness that usually passes unnoticed, my granddaughter brought me something she'd found at a flea market in Lublin during her semester abroad. She said it caught her eye because of the worn leather cover, because it looked like it had lived through 100 hands before hers. At first, I opened it without much care. Just another relic, another forgotten notebook with pages yellowed by time. Some were blank, some were stained with water, maybe blood. And then I saw it, a single name, written in blue ink. Written in my own youthful hand, the hand I had almost forgotten. Anna Zielinska. The letters tilted slightly forward, as if they were leaning toward a future that never came. Next to the name, a line I had written by lantern light in an army tent in Italy during the war. If you are ever born, this diary will be yours. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled. My chest tightened, as if 70 years had collapsed in a single heartbeat. I thought I had buried this forever. The hope, the grief, the silence. And yet here it was, staring back at me from fragile paper, refusing to be forgotten. In that moment, I understood something I had never dared to believe. My blood did not end with me. It lives on. It lives in her. And as my granddaughter sat across from me, her eyes wide with questions she had not yet found the courage to ask, I realized she was holding more than an old diary. She was holding proof that love, even interrupted, even scattered by war, leaves traces, and sometimes those traces find their way home. And if this story touches you the way it touched me while writing it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. It was 1944 in the hills of Italy, when war felt endless and the earth itself seemed to bleed beneath our boots. Each day was heavy, like mud clinging to your body, refusing to let go. We lived between valleys of fear and ridges of fleeting hope, though hope was the rarest thing of all, a luxury many of us no longer dared to afford. The air smelled of damp uniforms, of gunpowder, of smoke drifting from villages burned down to their foundations, and sometimes of prayers whispered too softly for God to hear. Somewhere between Monte Cassino and Ancona, I came across a battered military notebook. I don't know whose it had been. Maybe a comrade who fell, maybe someone who couldn't bear to carry it anymore. The cover was scuffed, the corners torn, but the paper inside was strong enough to hold the weight of words. I began to write, not to keep history, but to keep myself alive. Writing was the only way to keep my soul from slipping into silence. At night, when the guns quieted and the only sound was the labored breathing of men around me, I would open that notebook. By lantern light or the faint glow of a cigarette, I would let the words spill out. Death was everywhere, in the faces of boys who were too young to die, in the silence of empty bunks, in the way names became shadows and shadows became nothing. But amid all of that, I kept writing about her, Helena. The woman I left behind in Warsaw, the woman who kissed me goodbye in 1942 and told me she would wait. Her last letter reached me in December of 1943, shorter than usual, filled with worry. She told me she was pregnant. She told me she was afraid. She told me she did not know if she would ever see me again. I remember reading that letter 100 times under the dim light of the barracks. My heart clung to it, as if those words alone could carry me home. I promised myself, I promised her, that I would return. that we would dance again to the radio on Nowy Świat Street, that our child would know his father not only through a fading photograph. And so, one night, when the battlefield was quiet, when the moon shone pale over ruins that looked like broken teeth in the earth, I sat inside that tent, opened the notebook and wrote, "Anna Zielinska, if you are ever born, this diary will be yours." It wasn't just a name, it was a vow, a thread invisible but unbreakable, binding my present to a future I might never see. Helena had always said that if it was a girl, she wanted to name her Anna, after her grandmother. The name carried strength in its simplicity. It was soft but unyielding. Writing it down felt like pulling light into a place consumed by darkness. For days afterward, I kept that notebook pressed against my chest, as if the words themselves were a shield. If Anna existed, or ever would, then I had to survive. I could not let myself die until I knew, until I heard her cry, saw her face, felt her tiny hand gripping my finger. When the men around me saw me writing, they laughed. They said I wanted to be a poet. They thought the scribbles were foolish, a waste of time. But they didn't know that I was building a lifeline, not for glory, not for memory, but for the fragile chance that somewhere, somehow, my words would one day reach her. In those pages, I was more than a soldier. I was a father already, a husband in spirit if not in presence. A man who refused to be reduced to a rank, a number, a casualty. I was someone who loved, even in the midst of death. Looking back now, I wonder if I truly believed Anna would read those words one day, or if I was simply creating her from sheer force of will. Perhaps writing her name was my way of keeping her alive before she was ever born, of insisting to the universe that love could exist even here, even now. But I know this. When the diary returned to me decades later, when those same words stared back at me from yellowed pages, I realized that the hope I poured into them had not died. It had waited, it had survived, just like she had. When the war finally ended, others celebrated. They kissed strangers in the streets, lifted their arms toward the sky, and let themselves believe the nightmare was over. But for me, there was no victory, no relief, only silence. The kind of silence that gnaws at you more than gunfire ever could. I carried my uniform back to Poland, but I carried no certainty, no hope, only questions that pressed into my chest like bayonets. Warsaw, in 1946, was not a city, it was a skeleton. Streets I had once walked with Helena were unrecognizable, reduced to piles of stone and ash. Buildings where we had laughed, where we had dreamed were gone, their windows nothing but hollow sockets staring into the void. I walked through those ruins with a photograph in my hand. Helena's face, blurred at the edges, her eyes still bright. I asked everyone I could find, old women sweeping rubble from stoops, men scavenging metal from collapsed roofs, children barefoot in the dust. "Have you seen her, Helena Zielinska?" The answers were always the same. Shakes of the head, pitying looks, sometimes rumors. One man swore he had seen her fleeing during the uprising, a baby in her arms. Another said she had died in a bombing. Someone else whispered she had gone south, across the border. Each story carved me open. Each maybe tore away another piece of my soul. Certainty would have been easier than this abyss of doubt. For months, I chased shadows. I wrote letters to addresses that no longer existed, sent messages to towns I had never heard of, followed names through refugee lists and Red Cross records. Most came back stamped undeliverable. Some never came back at all. I would hold the returned envelopes in my hands like small coffins, each one sealing another possibility. One day, a letter reached me from a woman I did not know. She claimed she had met Helena in 1945, that she was carrying a little girl with dark eyes and a red sweater. She wrote that the child's name was Anna. My heart stopped. Could it be? Was it true? I read the letter until the ink seemed to blur, until the words felt burned into my skin, but then nothing more. No address, no way to confirm. Just another fragment, another cruel possibility dangled before me, then snatched away. At some point, exhaustion replaced hope. I stopped searching, not because I didn't care, but because I had no strength left. I was 27 years old, but I felt ancient, like all my years had been burned up in the fire of war and longing. I took work as a carpenter in Lublin, repairing doors, shaping tables, sanding cabinets. My hands, once curled around a rifle, now held chisels and saws. Wood became my companion. It was solid, predictable. It never disappeared in the night. But even as I built with wood, I lived with absence. I never married. I had women now and then, but never love, never permanence. Always, between me and any intimacy, there was a ghost. Helena's voice, Anna's name. How could I promise myself to someone else, when in some corner of the world, perhaps, my true family still existed? How could I build a new home when the ruins of the old one never stopped calling me? I left Poland in the early 1950s. America was calling to men like me, men who had nothing left but hands willing to work. Chicago became my home. Its neighborhoods smelled of pierogi and kielbasa, of beer in corner taverns where Polish voices filled the air. I opened a small carpentry shop on the south side. To my neighbors, I was just another immigrant trying to carve out a life. To my co-workers, I was steady, patient, dependable. No one knew the nights I spent staring at the ceiling, whispering names into the dark. Helena, Anna. The years piled on like layers of dust in the shop. Work gave me rhythm, but not purpose. People said I was calm, that I listened well, that my hands had the gift of patience, but inside I was always waiting for a knock at the door, for a letter that never came, for a daughter I had only ever known through imagination. Every night before sleep, I let myself dream her. At first a baby with wide eyes, then a little girl in a floral dress. Then a teenager, perhaps playing piano, perhaps reading by lamplight, perhaps gazing out a window with the same quiet sadness I carried in my chest. Eventually, I dreamed her as a grown woman, a wife, a mother, someone who never knew me, yet who lived because of me. Anna became a presence I could not escape. She was with me as I worked wood, as I drank tea, as I watched the snow fall outside Chicago's narrow windows. She was a ghost who never left, a child of memory and longing. Decades passed. Friends died. The shop grew quieter. My body stiffened, my hair whitened, but the emptiness remained sharp as ever. Some wounds do not fade, they simply settle deeper until they are part of the bone itself. And so I thought this was how my story would end, not with answers, but with silence. With love buried under ruins, with a child who never knew me, with a diary I had abandoned in a field hospital, left behind because I believed it no longer had meaning. I thought I would die that way, a carpenter in Chicago, remembered only for tables and chairs, not for the family I had once almost had. But I was wrong, because one day, decades later, the diary returned. I had long accepted that the diary I once carried through the war was gone forever, left behind in a field hospital in Italy, buried in the chaos of retreat and survival. I thought it had vanished like everything else from that time, scattered among ruins, trampled under boots, forgotten by history. But I was wrong. It was my granddaughter, Emily, who brought it back to me. She was studying abroad in Poland, tracing fragments of our family's history for her university research. On a Sunday morning, after visiting a flea market in Lublin, she came home with a bundle wrapped in newspaper. She placed it on my kitchen table with the same innocence she had when she used to hand me drawings as a child. "Grandpa," she said, "I found this old notebook. The man selling it said it came from a box of war memorabilia. I thought you might find it interesting." I unwrapped it slowly. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, scarred with marks of time. The clasp was broken, but the spine still held. It smelled of dust, of smoke, of rainwater long dried into its fibers. I touched it with the tips of my fingers and felt something stir inside me, a memory trying to claw its way back to the surface. I opened it. The first pages were faded, smudged, words lost to age. Others carried stains, dark ones like dried blood, lighter ones like tears pressed into paper decades ago. I flipped further, my breath uneven, my heart pounding as if I were back in the trenches, waiting for the next shell to fall. And then I saw it. My own handwriting, younger, firmer, brimming with a confidence I no longer recognized. Blue ink tilted forward, eager, reaching, and on that page, clear and undeniable, was her name. Anna Zielinska. If you are ever born, this diary will be yours. The room seemed to spin. My hands trembled, my eyes blurred, I couldn't speak. It felt as if time itself had folded, as if the young soldier I had once been had reached across 70 years to place this message directly into my aging hands. Emily leaned closer. "Grandpa, are you all right?" I wanted to answer, but my voice cracked. I touched the page, as if touching her, as if somehow the letters themselves carried her heartbeat. Memories rushed back. Helena's laughter, the way she touched my face the last time we said goodbye, the sound of church bells in Warsaw before the war, and the night in that tent when I wrote those words, clutching a hope I didn't know how to name. Emily's eyes searched mine. "Who was Anna?" she asked softly. For a long time I said nothing. My throat closed, my chest ached. Finally, I whispered the truth I had carried like a hidden wound all my life. "Maybe you." She looked startled, then curious, then quiet. Her eyes, Helena's eyes, filled with tears she tried to hold back. She turned the pages slowly, reverently, as if each line was a relic. She read my words, my fears, my prayers, my love for a child who, to me, had only existed in imagination. Sitting there, across from her, I felt the weight of the decades collapse. The silence I had carried no longer belonged only to me. I had shared it. I had passed it on, and in that moment the emptiness inside me no longer felt so heavy. We sat at the kitchen table for hours, she reading aloud, me listening to the echo of my younger self. At times, I closed my eyes, ashamed of my tears. At other times, I stared at her face and wondered how much of Helena I could see, how much of Anna. When the evening light faded and the room grew dark, Emily placed her hand over mine. "Grandpa," she whispered, "maybe we should find out the truth, together." The word "together" struck me harder than any artillery shell ever had. All those years of searching alone, all those nights of silent prayers. Now, for the first time, I was not alone. I nodded. My voice was barely audible, but it was steady. Yes, together. And in that fragile agreement, something shifted. The past was no longer a wound that bled in silence. It was a path that could still be walked. When Emily and I decided to search, I thought it might end the same way all my other searches had ended, with silence. I had spent years after the war chasing rumors, following trails that vanished into nothing, but this time it was different. This time I wasn't alone. Emily had the heart of a historian and the persistence of someone who believed the past could still speak. She wrote to archives in Poland, to the Red Cross, to parish offices in villages near the Czech border. She spent nights scrolling through digitized records, whispering translations to me across the table, her laptop glowing in the dark kitchen. Weeks passed. Most replies came back with nothing or with polite regrets. But then one afternoon, she printed out a page and laid it in front of me. "Grandpa," she said, her voice trembling, "look, there it was. Helena Zielinska, born 1921, Warsaw. Residence after the war, a small village called Ushi near the border. I stared at the words until they blurred. She had survived. Helena, the woman I had kissed goodbye in 1942, the woman whose letters had been my lifeline in Italy, had lived. It was enough to make my chest ache with both joy and sorrow. Joy that she hadn't perished as I had feared. Sorrow that I had never found her, never held her again. Emily wasn't finished. She kept digging. A week later, she came to me with another document, a baptismal record from 1945. A little girl born in Usie, Anna Helena Zielinska. Mother, Helena. Father, unknown. The words cut me open. Unknown. She had believed I was gone, and perhaps it was safer not to write my name. But I didn't need the record to tell me. I knew. I knew with the certainty of blood Anna had lived. Emily's research gave us fragments of her story. Anna grew up in that village, surrounded by mountains and rivers, instead of the city Helena had once loved. She went to school, became a teacher's wife, and raised 3 children of her own. She died 10 years earlier, peacefully, surrounded by family. One of those children was Emily's mother. I sat at the table, the papers spread before me like pieces of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for 70 years. My hands shook as I traced the lines, as if touching the ink might somehow connect me to them. My voice cracked when I finally said it aloud. "Emily, that means you. You are her granddaughter. You are Anna's daughter. You are my blood." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "I always wondered why I felt drawn to Poland," she whispered. "Now I know." I could barely speak. For decades I had carried the emptiness of not knowing whether my child had lived or died. I had buried the hope that she might one day call me father, and now, across the years, across oceans and silences, life had found a way. Helena had survived. Anna had lived. And through her children, through Emily sitting across from me with tears on her cheeks, I was not alone. My blood had not ended with me. It had continued quietly, invisibly, until the day it returned in the form of my granddaughter holding my diary. That night, I sat awake long after Emily had gone to bed. The papers lay beside me, the diary open to the page with Anna's name. I thought of Helena, of her courage, of the life she had built without me. I thought of Anna, of the childhood I had missed, the milestones I had never shared, her first steps, her first words, her wedding day. I thought of the years I had spent imagining her, not knowing she was real all along. Regret pressed heavily on me, but beneath it was something else, gratitude. Gratitude that even though I had walked in darkness for so long, the story had not ended in darkness. Life had endured. Love had endured. The next morning, Emily brewed coffee in the kitchen while I watched her move. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she furrowed her brow while reading. In her gestures, I saw echoes of Helena. In her eyes, I saw Anna. I whispered to myself so softly she could not hear, "I see you now, all of you, and I am finally home." From that moment on, everything felt different, not in grand, dramatic ways, but quietly, like the slow change of seasons. The emptiness that had lived inside me for so many years began to soften. The silence that once pressed against my chest no longer felt like a void, but like a space finally filled with meaning. The diary, once a wound, became a gift. For decades, it had been the record of my longing, my grief, my unanswered prayers. Now it was proof that something had endured, not just war, not just time, but love. Love that had traveled across years and borders, surviving in the fragile line of ink that carried Anna's name. Emily began to copy the diary, page by page. She read passages aloud, her voice trembling as she spoke my younger self's words back into the room. Hearing them through her was like listening to a stranger, a boy with more hope than fear, with a vision of life still waiting ahead. And yet I recognized him. He was still me. I was still him. She told me she wanted to preserve the diary, to pass it down to her own children someday, not as a relic of war, but as a testament to love. She said, "Grandpa, it's not just your story anymore. It's ours." And in that moment, I felt something I had not felt in a lifetime: peace. Sometimes I sit alone with the diary open in my lap. My fingers trace the faded ink. My eyes follow the words I once wrote in desperation. I think of Helena, her laughter, her bravery, her silence. I think of Anna, the daughter I never held, but who still lived, still grew, still gave life. And I think of Emily, my granddaughter, my living proof that nothing was lost forever. For years I believed my story had ended in ruins, that love had been buried, that hope had been extinguished, that the bloodline ended with me. But I see now that I was wrong. The story lived on, quietly, invisibly, waiting for the right moment to return. I saw your name in the diary, and I realized my blood still lives. Not as sorrow, not as regret, but as legacy, as continuity, as love that refused to die, even when I thought I had. Emily smiles at me sometimes and says, "Grandpa, you finally found her." I nod, though the truth is more complicated. I didn't find Anna. Life found her for me. Life carried her forward, even when I stumbled, even when I gave up. And that is enough. If this story touched you the way it touched me while telling it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep sharing real stories, stories that inspire, stories that move, stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. We share new stories every day, real lives that move and inspire.